Hey friends, have you ever looked back over your life and realized that something God was doing didn't begin where you thought it did? I've been thinking about that a lot lately. After sharing the story of our infertility, the adoption journey, and the incredible way that God brought James and Tyler into our family, I found myself looking backward, not at what happened, at what had been happening inside of me all along. For years, I assumed that one trip changed everything. A trip to Guatemala, walking through an orphanage, meeting little faces that I'll never forget. I thought that was the moment God began preparing my heart for adoption. But the more I've reflected, the more I think I had the timeline wrong. Guatemala didn't create my heart, it revealed it. Because when I really trace that thread backward, it doesn't begin in another country. It begins with a little girl trying to make sense of two very different worlds. Growing up, I lived between two homes that couldn't have felt more different emotionally. Both loved me, but they carried different atmospheres. One home was deeply marked by grief that had settled into anger, bitterness, unpredictability, and the other felt calm, steady, and safe. As a child, I didn't have the words to explain those differences. I couldn't have told you anything about emotional regulation or family systems. I just knew that they felt different. And somewhere along the way, instead of simply reacting to those differences, I became fascinated by them. I wanted to understand, why did one person respond with so much peace while another carried so much pain? How could two people love deeply and yet express that love in such different ways? I don't think I realized it then, but I had already started asking the question that would follow me for the rest of my life. What happened to shape this person? That question would quietly become the lens through which I'd begin to see almost everyone that I met. Not because I had answers and not because I thought I could fix anyone, but because I've never been very interested in judging people before understanding them. Looking back now, I think God was teaching me something long before I ever recognized this lesson. He was teaching me to look beyond behavior and become curious about the story underneath. And as I grew older, that way of seeing people didn't disappear. It simply followed me into new places. High school was probably one of the best examples. Most of us remember high school by the group that we belonged to. Maybe it was the athletes or the band or the theater kids or the popular crowd, the outsiders. If someone asked me where I fit, I'm honestly not sure I could have given you one answer. I spent a lot of time with our drill team, not because I was dancing on the football field. You would never have convinced me to do that. I would have rather died than stand in front of a stadium full of people. Instead, I became the drill team manager. I loved everything that happened behind the scenes, setting things up, building props, organizing supplies, making sure everything was ready before everyone else arrived. And looking back on that, that probably shouldn't surprise me either. I've always been drawn towards creating spaces where other people could flourish. But there was another group of friends too, the kids who gathered behind the school. The ones who most adults probably looked at and then quickly dismissed. Some of them were smoking, some of them were experiencing with drugs or experimenting with drugs. Some were simply trying to survive lives that felt much heavier than most people realized. What's interesting is this. They never pressured me. In fact, they were incredibly protective of me. People talk a lot about peer pressure, but that wasn't my experience. They knew I wasn't interested in doing the things that they were doing, and they never tried to change my mind. Instead, they introduced me to their parents. I've laughed at that over the years. I think I was their decoy. If mom or dad met Kim, surely everything must be fine, at least for a little while. But looking back on that now, I realized something much deeper was happening. I wasn't there because I approved of every decision they were making. I wasn't there because I wanted to join them. I was there because I genuinely liked them. I wanted to understand them, even then. I remember wondering what everyone else saw was rebellion might actually be something else. Maybe for some it was experimentation, but for others I had a feeling that it was pain. an escape, a longing to belong somewhere, a desire to quiet something inside that they didn't know how to name. And I didn't have those words as a teenager, but my sociology classes were years away. But somehow I already found myself asking the same question that I'd been asking since I was little. I wonder what happened to them. Not what's wrong with them, but what story are they carrying that I can't see? I didn't know it then, but that question would eventually shape my education, my career, my ministry, and ultimately Healer and Hope Giver itself. When I graduated from high school, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a teacher. Not because I love standing in front of a classroom, because honestly, that would have still terrified me. It was never about being the person in front of the room. It was about the students sitting in the desks. Even as a teenager, I found myself captivated by stories about kids who had difficult home lives. I remember watching Dangerous Minds when it came out. Most people probably watched it as a movie. I watched it as a possibility. I remember thinking, there are kids who just need someone to believe in them. And that stayed with me. For a while, I pursued education because I thought teaching was the way I could get to do that. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. I realized the question that fascinated me wasn't how do I teach these people? It was how do I become or how do people become who they become? That question led me to change my major to sociology. I know sociology sometimes gets reduced to stereotypes or statistics, but that's never what it was to me. To me, sociology was the study of stories. It helped me to understand how families, communities, relationships, cultures, loss, and belonging all leave fingerprints on who we become. Suddenly, I had a language for questions I had been asking since I was a little girl. Why do two people respond so differently to similar circumstances? Why does one child flourish while another struggles? Why do some people spend their lives trying to prove that they're enough while others seem completely secure in who they are? And the more I studied, the more I realized something. Very few people become who they are overnight. Most of us are carrying years of experiences, beautiful ones, painful ones, and everything in between. Those experiences shape the way we see ourselves, the way we trust, and the way we love, and sometimes even the way we protect ourselves from being hurt again. That realization didn't make me excuse unhealthy choices, but it did make me slower to judge them. Because once you begin to understand someone else's story, it's much harder to reduce them to a single decision. After college, I had an opportunity to step into work that reflected those same passions. I interned with Children's Miracle Network. I loved meeting the families and hearing their stories, watching people rally around children facing impossible circumstances. For a while, I even considered working with Child Protective Services. On paper, it seemed exactly like the kind of work that I'd always been imagining doing. Helping children, helping families, being present in difficult situations. But John knew me well enough to ask a different question. Not, could you do it? He knew I could. Instead, he asked, should you? And there's wisdom in that question. Just because you're capable of something doesn't always mean that's where you're meant to spend your life. He gently reminded me that my heart tends to carry people long after I leave the room. He knew that walking into the darkest situations every single day might slowly crush something that God had placed inside of me. And at the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but now I think he was protecting not my compassion, but my calling. Because God wasn't asking me to carry every story. He was teaching me how to hold stories with compassion without believing I had to save everyone myself. That lesson has served me more times than I can count. As meaningful as those years were, I still had no idea where God was leading. I hadn't been to Guatemala yet. I hadn't walked through infertility. I hadn't become a mom. I hadn't worked with nonprofits. I certainly hadn't started a podcast. But somehow, when I look back on it all, I can see that every one of those experiences was building on the same foundation. God wasn't changing my heart. He was patiently revealing the one He had created from the very beginning. A few years after college, my parents made the decision that would change all of our lives. They were adopting two little children from Guatemala. Their names were Joshua and Gabriella, and even in that story, there was contrast. Joshua had spent his early years in an orphanage, and he lived among many other toddlers, caregivers that did the very best they could. But when there were that many little ones needing attention, life becomes about meeting needs as best you can. Gabriella's beginning looked completely different. She had been living with a foster family. Every night she fell asleep in the same bed as her foster parents. Two children, the same country, completely different beginnings. And if you look at it now, I'm struck by how often God has used contrasts to teach me. Two homes, two groups of friends in high school, two very different paths into the same family. Again, I found myself asking questions. Not because one story was better than the other, but because I wanted to understand them both. How would these different beginnings shape them? What would they had they experienced? What would they remember? What would they need as they grew? Those questions stayed with me long before we ever boarded a plane. And when we arrived in Guatemala, I still remember walking into Josh's orphanage. There were some moments in life that never really leave you, and that was one of them. I don't remember every detail, but I remember the little faces. Toddlers walking around with curious eyes, some playing together, some simply watching the adults coming and going. I remember thinking how confusing that day must have felt for them. People were arriving, children were leaving, life was changing, even if they couldn't fully understand it yet. Joshua was just learning to walk in shoes, and I can still hear the sound of his little flat feet as they hurried across the floor. It's funny what stays with you, not the grand moments, the little sounds and the little details, the small memories that somehow never fade. When it was time to leave the orphanage, my heart stayed behind. I looked at those little faces, and every part of me wanted to bring them all home. Not because I thought I could fix their lives, and not because I believed I could rescue them, simply because I loved them. Or maybe a better way to say it is, my heart broke for them. At the time, I assumed that feeling was preparing me for adoption. But looking back, I don't think that's what God was doing. I think He was simply revealing something that had always been true. I've always been drawn toward people whose stories most of the world never sees. People carrying invisible chapters, people whose circumstances tell only a fraction of who they really are. The orphanage didn't create that in me. It simply made it impossible to ignore. And a few days later, we flew home, but not all together. My parents continued on to Michigan with Josh, and I flew back to Houston. I remember standing in the airport as I was leaving and they were going to catch their next flight. And I was standing in the airport watching Josh in his little stroller. He was finally with his family and he was finally going home. And yet there was another goodbye. As I watched them disappear into the line for their connecting flight, my heart broke all over again. Not because something was wrong, but because I loved him already, and because I wasn't going with him. I watched that little stroller disappear farther and farther away until I couldn't see it anymore, and I cried all the way home. For years, I thought that trip was about preparing me to become a mother, and maybe in some ways it was, but I think it was doing something deeper. It was teaching me that love often begins long before someone belongs in your family. Sometimes love simply begins because you're willing to truly see another human being. And once you've really seen them, it's very difficult to look away. For a long time, I thought all of those experiences were separate stories: a complicated childhood, high school friendships, a sociology degree, Children's Miracle Network, Guatemala, infertility, adoption, motherhood, working in nonprofits, a church ministry, this podcast. And if you had asked me 10 years ago what all those things had in common, I don't know that I could have answered. They just felt like different seasons of life. But somewhere along the way, I stopped looking at them as individual stories and started seeing the thread that connected them all. It wasn't that God kept putting me in and putting hurting people in my path, it's that He kept teaching me how to see them, not as projects and not as problems, not as people who needed me to have all the answers, but simply as people with stories. People whose behavior often made a lot more sense once you understood what they'd been through. That's become one of the greatest gifts of my life. Not because I always understand, I certainly don't, but because I've learned to become curious enough before becoming critical, to ask, I wonder what happened before I ever ask what's wrong. And that simple shift changed almost every relationship in my life. The way it changed the way I parent. It changed the way I work. It changed the way I lead. It changed the way I see people in church. It changes the way I approach conflict. It even changed the way I see myself. Because if we're honest, we're often the people we judge the most harshly. We look at our own fears, our own failures, our own reactions, and assume they appeared out of nowhere. But they didn't. We have stories too. We have chapters that shaped us, moments that wounded us, people who encouraged us, people who disappointed us, experiences that taught us to hide, and experiences that taught us to fight, experiences that taught us to stay quiet, and experiences that taught us to keep everyone else happy. The older I get, the more convinced I become that very few people are reacting to today, only to today. Most of us are carrying yesterday into the present, not because we want to, but because we're human. That's one of the reasons I believe healing matters so deeply. Healing isn't pretending those chapters never mattered or happened. Healing is allowing God to gently put the pieces back together so those chapters no longer have to write the ending. And that's what He's been doing in my own life, not erasing my story, redeeming it. And I don't believe He redeems our stories so we can simply admire what He has done. I think He redeems them so we can sit beside someone else and quietly say, You're not alone. Over the last few years, I've realized something else. When people ask me what healer and hope giver is, it's actually a difficult question to answer. Some people might call it a podcast. Some people think it's a ministry. Others think it's a collection of resources. And yes, it includes all of those things. But none of those are really what I'm building. What I've come to realize is I'm building the place that I always wished had existed. A place where people don't have to have everything figured out before they show up. A place where you don't have to hide the hard chapters. A place where someone sits down across the table from you and says, Tell me your story. Not because they're looking for gossip and not because they're trying to fix you, because they genuinely want to understand. I think that's what Jesus did so beautifully. He looked past what everyone else could see. He saw the woman at the well, and He knew there was a story there. He saw Zacchaeus, and He knew there was a story there. He saw Peter, and knew there was a story within that. He never reduced people to their hardest chapter. He always saw who they could become. And that's the kind of place I hope that Healer and Hope Giver becomes. Not a place where people are labeled, a place where they are known. Not a place where they're rushed, a place where healing is allowed to take all the time it needs, and not a place where people are expected to perform, a place where hope is gently restored. Because here's what I've learned over these years. Healing rarely begins the moment someone gets advice. It often begins the moment someone finally feels like they've been seen. Sometimes I wonder what my life would look like if I had only paid attention to the big moments. If I'd only looked for God in the dramatic, the obvious, the mountaintop experiences. I think I would have missed almost everything. Because when I look back now, I don't see one defining moment. I see hundreds of little ones. A little girl trying to understand why two homes felt so different. A teenager sitting comfortably in two worlds that rarely understood each other. A college student captivated by the question of what shapes a human heart. A young woman walking through an orphanage unable to stop looking into the faces of the children most people would never know. A wife praying through infertility with a red notebook full of honest conversations with God. A mom learning that every child has a story before they ever have words to tell it. A nonprofit communicator trying to help missions reach people who needed them the most. None of those moments felt connected while I was living them. They felt almost ordinary. Some felt painful, a few felt completely confusing, but now I can see that God wasn't asking me to figure out my calling all at once. He was faithfully shaping my heart one chapter at a time, and maybe that's true for you too. Maybe you've been waiting for God to hand you a blueprint when He's leaving breadcrumbs behind. Maybe the things that have consistently stirred your heart, the people that you've always been drawn toward, the questions you've never been able to stop asking, aren't random at all. Maybe they're invitations, not necessarily telling you exactly what to do, but revealing something about who God is forming you to become. I think we spend so much of our lives asking, "What do you want me to do, Lord?" And maybe before He answers that question, He spends years answering a different one. Who are you becoming? Because what we do will change throughout our lives. I've been a student. I've been a nonprofit communicator. I've been a church administrator. I've been a homeschool mom, an author, a podcaster. Those roles haven't changed. The thread hasn't. The thread has always been the same: helping people feel seen, helping people understand that they are more than the hardest chapter that they've lived, helping people discover that healing and hope are still possible. I didn't invent that thread. I simply kept following it. And somewhere along the way, I realized it had been leading me here all along, to this table, to these conversations, to this community. When people ask me what healer and hope giver is becoming, I don't usually start by talking about podcasts or books or companion guides. Those are simply tools. What I hope we're building together is something much deeper: a place where stories are safe, where questions are welcome, where healing isn't rushed, where hope is patiently restored, where we stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What has shaped me and what might God be redeeming here?" A place where we remember that none of us are defined by our hardest chapter, because the author is still writing. And if he's still writing, then there's still hope out there, friends. Not just hope that life gets easier, hope that God continues to redeem us, to restore, to heal, to transform. That's the place I want healer and hope giver to become. Not because I have all the answers, but because I've spent my whole life discovering that some of the greatest healing begins when someone looks you in the eyes, listens to your story, and reminds you that God hasn't stopped writing. So today, I simply want to leave you with one question. What thread might God be weaving that you may not have recognized until now? Maybe, just maybe, He's been preparing your heart far longer than you've ever realized. And perhaps the very experiences you've questioned the most are becoming the places where you'll one day offer someone else the greatest hope. As I was preparing this episode, something unexpected happened. I thought I was simply looking back over my life, trying to trace a thread that connected childhood and high school and college, Guatemala, infertility, adoption, working for nonprofits, and all the places in between. But somewhere in the middle of writing, I realized I wasn't just tracing a thread. I was discovering a destination. For years, if someone had asked me what healer and hope giver was, I probably would have said it was a podcast. And while that's true, it's almost incredibly incomplete. It's become companion guides and devotionals and coffee table conversations and reflective workbooks and guided healing workbooks, a weekly email, a website, resources that continue the conversation long after the microphones have been turned off. And from the outside, that probably looks like a lot of different projects. But sitting here with you today, I don't think they're different at all. I think they're all just a different expression of the same desire that God has been growing in my heart for as long as I can remember, to create a place where people feel safe enough to tell the truth. And as I've looked back over the years, I've realized something else. I've never really been chasing a stage. Even in high school, I didn't want to be the one performing on the football field. I wanted to be the drill team manager. I loved building props, organizing the details, making sure everyone else had what they needed before they stepped into the spotlight. I found joy in helping someone else shine. And that same thread followed me into my career. I spent years working behind the scenes in nonprofit organizations. Most days didn't feel glamorous one bit. There were databases to maintain, events to organize, communications to write, spreadsheets to update, the kinds of jobs that most people never even notice. But I loved knowing that every detail mattered because every detail helped shape someone else's mission to reach one more person. I wasn't the one standing at the front of the room. I was helping build the room. And later I found myself doing many of those same things in church ministry. Again, I wasn't trying to build a name for myself. I wanted to help create spaces where people could encounter Jesus, where families could feel welcomed, where children belonged, where ministries had the support they needed to flourish. And as I look back, I don't think those were simply jobs. I think God was quietly teaching me how to prepare a place, not a perfect place and not a polished place, but a welcoming place. Maybe that's why the image that keeps coming to my mind isn't a stage, it's a table. A table doesn't ask you to perform, it invites you to sit down. A table makes room for conversation, for questions, for laughter, for tears, for stories that are still unfinished. Around a table, people don't have to pretend they've got everything figured out. They simply have to show up. And that's the place my heart naturally returns to. Now, if one day God chooses to put me on a stage, I will go. Not because I was chasing one, but because I've learned that His plans have always been better than mine. If He opens that door, I'll trust Him enough to walk through it. But whether the conversation happens on a stage, around a coffee table, in a companion guide, or through a quiet conversation between two friends, my prayer will always be the same: that people feel seen, that they find healing, and that they leave with a little hope, and that they become more fully who God created them to be. And as I sat with that thought, I realized something else. Maybe that's what I've been trying to build all along. Not a place where people arrive because they finally figured life out. A place where they can arrive while they're still trying to do that. A place where someone can carry grief, or carrying grief doesn't have to explain why they're still hurting. A place where someone wrestling with unanswered prayers doesn't get handed easy answers. A place where someone weighed down by shame remembers they are still deeply loved by God. A place where we stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What has shaped me and what might God be redeeming?" Those are very different questions. One assumes that there's a problem or that we are the problem. The other assumes that God is still writing. When I think about the conversations that we've had together, I realize I've never wanted this place to be a place that simply hands out answers. I've wanted it to be a place that helps us ask better questions. Questions that invite us to look beneath the surface. Questions that create compassion instead of condemnation. Questions that remind us that every person has a story and that every story matters to God. It's probably no surprise that when I think about Jesus, I picture Him around a table. He didn't wait for people to have their lives together before He welcomed them. He met them where they were. He listened, He asked questions, He shared meals. He made space for people who had spent most of their lives believing there wasn't a place for them. I don't know that I fully understood that until this week, but I think that's what Healer and Hope Giver has been becoming all along. Not because I planned it that way, because God has been preparing my heart for it for decades, through very different homes, through friends whose stories most people would never stop to listen to, through a sociology degree that taught me to look beneath the surface, through Guatemala, through infertility, through adoption, through nonprofit work, through ministry, and through every story that taught me a little bit more about compassion and a little less about quick conclusions. If you've listened to this episode today, I hope you won't simply remember my story. I hope you'll become curious about your own. What thread has God been weaving through your life? What kinds of people have you always found yourself drawn toward? What questions have never stopped tugging at your heart? What burdens have you carried that refuse to let you look away? Maybe those things aren't distractions. Maybe they're invitations. Maybe the very experiences you've questioned the most have quietly been preparing you to love people in a way that only you can, because no one else has lived your story. No one else has seen what you've seen. No one else has learned exactly what you've learned as you've walked through, with God, your own chapters. And perhaps that's the beautiful mystery of His kingdom. He doesn't waste our stories, He redeems them. Then He weaves them together into something much bigger than any one life could ever become on its own. So if Healer and Hope Giver is becoming anything, my prayer is that it becomes a table, a place where you can bring your whole story, where healing isn't rushed, where hope is patiently restored, where you are deeply seen, and where together we keep becoming who God is lovingly shaping us to be. Because the same God who has been faithfully weaving the thread through my life has been faithfully weaving one through yours as well. One day, you may look back, just as I have, and discover that the thread you thought was random was actually the hand of a loving Father, patiently preparing your heart for people He's already been preparing you to love. And when that day comes, I hope you'll pull up another chair, because there's always room at the table. As I prepared this episode, I realized something. There were so many moments that helped shape the way I see people that I couldn't possibly fit into one conversation. This week's episode reflection is an opportunity to slow down and begin noticing the thread in your own story. Together, we'll reflect on the people, places, experiences, and questions that have quietly shaped who you are becoming. You don't need to have your calling completely figured out. Sometimes the next step simply begins by recognizing the way God has already been at work. You can download this week's free episode reflection along with every episode and resource at healerhopegiver.com. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, friends. If today's conversation encouraged you, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need the reminder that God is still working in their story. And if you haven't already, I'd love for you to follow Healer and Hope Giver wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe there as well. Along with each week's conversations, you'll find our coffee table conversations, as well as weekly shorts and other encouragements that don't always make it into the podcast. Until next time, keep walking towards healing, keep holding on to hope, and keep becoming who God is healing you to be. I'll see you on Thursday.